Hi everyone, my name is Kelsey and I'm a student partner here at STLI. Today I am with Professor Stiman and we're going to talk a little bit about how her research might influence the way that we can reapproach promoting wellness on campus. And so if you're new here, I'm doing a project this semester that kind of looks into what we can do to better promote wellness on campus through interviewing some professors in various disciplines and then culminating into a final video essay. So like I said, I am with Professor Stiman here today. She's an assistant professor of sociology with research into urban and rural sociology, culture, community, participatory democracy, and housing. And she kind of looks into the idea of identity, belonging, and community engagement, which is exactly up this podcast alley. And I really wanted to get to the bottom of why she constantly goes above and beyond what's required of her as a professor to help just make students know that they're more than students and that they're valued as human beings in general. So with that, welcome, Professor Stiman, and if I left anything out, feel free to add it.
Oh, thank you, Kelsey. That was a very holistic and also very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. So I kind of briefly touched on your research interests and the research you've done, but if possible, can you kind of summarize what you look into, maybe past research you've done?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say I became interested in being a community sociologist. That's kind of how I identify myself years ago when I took a grad class on community sociology. I loved the sociological imagination. I loved sort of like learning how sociology can help explain everything in my life. And when I took a class on community sociology, I realized that I can do that to understand the communities around me. And so what I'm really interested in is how power operates in community, how people build social trust or do not in communities, what makes them kind of form and function, essentially. Right now, my project is on this small town in Maine, and the town relies on town meeting style governance, which basically means that everyone in town has a say in voting on things like zoning and tax expenditures and things like this. And so I'm really interested in how a community can come together and make decisions about things that matter to them. And so in doing that, I'm interested in sort of how they build social trust, how they talk to one another, how they come to make decisions about things that matter to them. And so when I am studying communities, I'm really interested in like how power operates in them and kind of what makes them work and what makes them not work.
And, as you're explaining all this, I can only imagine that, this power dynamic or just how you're saying we come to conclusions and come to decisions, how there's a good chance that might influence maybe the way that you go about your daily life more. I'm clearly not a STEM major, but I can imagine more than, say, a biologist, observing some really obscure little molecule. Yeah. So I'm curious if you've noticed this, if your research has influenced your life, and, especially your professor at the end of the day, too, how it's influenced maybe the way that you approach teaching.
That's one of my favorite questions. So in my research, I do a lot of observations of community meetings. And so I sit there and I watch how people talk to one another, whose voices are elevated in these more formal settings. And I find that these community settings tend to be really analogous to the classroom setting. And so I study basically like the dynamics that can disempower people in community settings, the dynamics that empower certain people in these settings. And so I'm always really attuned to those dynamics in my own classroom. And it's something that I think really carefully and critically about all the time. So for me, it's like the reverse. Like I want to figure out how I can empower everyone in my classroom. I want to make sure that not only a select few voices are heard and listened to. And so that's really like how I'm always like aware of these kind of group dynamics, right? And trying to like build social trust in the classroom in a way that I observe people trying to do in these community settings in a very formal way. And one of the very first things that I do every semester, and you know this, having taken my classes, is that I make students do this very awkward thing in which I take a video of them.
It's not that awkward, I promise.
I take a video of them saying their names, and I have to give a very important shout out to Professor Tom Linneman, who taught me this wonderful trick, that if you take a video of students saying their names and you just listen to the video and watch it a few times, you can learn students' names really, really quickly. And so I rely on this as like one of my first strategies when I'm trying to make people feel like seen and part of the classroom. Like there's nothing worse than calling on a student and not knowing their name from the student's perspective and from the professor's perspective. So anyway, that's one of the first things that I do to try to build that social trust really in the classroom.
Yeah.
In my smaller classes, I do some other things in which I try to make sure everyone has access to me, everyone can be heard and can use me as a resource. And so I mandate office hours. I know that this is a thing that a lot of professors do, but especially for my smaller classes, I make everyone come see me in my office hours. And I often have to cancel class to do this because some students work like 2 or 3 jobs, and so they can't come to my office hours or they can't schedule another time. And so I will often cancel a dedicated class period or 2 to do this so that students can come and have access to me, that they feel like they are part of the class, that they feel like they have access to me as well.
Yeah, I love that. I can even say it's incredible that on the second day of class, if not definitely by the third, you knew all of our names. Even if certain people just are not as vocal during the class time, you still know their names. So when you call on them, it's like it's a normal thing. And also, I think from principles of sociology, could be wrong, that there's a sociological finding that, you know, if you are maybe first generation college student or a minority, that you're least likely to seek out that extra help. So it makes a lot of sense that 1, you're following the research, but 2, that just having that initial push to come see you might help, you know, feel more included, more like you. It's not this abnormal thing to go seek help, which is usually the hardest first step for people. And so kind of based on what you're talking about too, I'm curious, obviously with the smaller sections of classes and specifically in sociology, there's this huge push from a lot of professors for a good reason to have this participation requirement of some sort, not to kind of put people on the spot, but just because it is helpful for students, for professors to know where everyone stands and to help each other try to learn the material in ways that make sense. So I'm curious with your approach, how you approach these kind of requirements.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in the larger classes, I think, and in the smaller classes, I like to think about participation much more holistically. Like, I mean, I think when people think participation, they think I need to raise my hand and answer questions every single time she asks a question, and that's not really what I'm getting at. And I try to like create different ways for students to participate. Not everyone feels comfortable raising their hand, answering questions all the time. And so in my larger classes, I allow students a lot of like virtual spaces to participate, and I count that towards participation grades. In my smaller classes, I count things like working in groups and talking in groups in these more low-stakes settings as forms of participation, coming to my office and talking through ideas, emailing me, figuring out or sharing things that they find interesting. That I often have like a space on Blackboard for students to share things that they find out in the world, and I institutionalize that as part of a participation grade. And that makes people feel less pressured to do that sort of raise your hand and answer all the time, which of course is really important. But I think also I will say that like approaching the classroom in terms of thinking of it as a community, my goal is to make it such that students feel as comfortable as possible in that setting so that they will participate and raise their hands and answer questions. It doesn't always work. But the goal of like creating this like inclusive environment is so that students want to be there and feel confident and comfortable engaging.
That reminds me of just another thing that you do, and how earlier this semester, actually, and about a week ago, you brought in Trader Joe's snacks to the class. And I remember so distinctly the first time you were like, well, you guys had a hard homework assignment, so I brought Trader Joe's snacks. I was like, where am I? And even last class, everyone seemed to be in a pretty decent mood comparatively, and you definitely noticed that the flow of conversation is drastically elevated when we're in better moods than when it's, the middle of midterms. Yeah. So I'm wondering, based on all the strategies that you're talking about, have students been receptive to these, and how have you maybe seen that playing out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I do think that, I tend to really enjoy my classroom environment. Like, it takes a lot of work to kind of establish it, but like once it's established, I think it's effective. And bringing in the food, right? Like, that's part of just like showing students that I recognize that they're human beings who maybe need like nourishment throughout the day. And it helps to build this like more comfortable environment where people feel like they can participate. And sometimes you just need a little caloric energy to like talk. So
especially college students.
Especially college
give
students.
Them food and they come running.
Exactly. And like some students, I find some students, they go from like 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock without having as much of a break to eat. And so anyway, our class meets at 2:30 in the afternoon. It's a tough time. But yeah, I have found it effective. Like from my first year seminars to even my large principles of sociology class, I find, generally speaking, that students feel like they can talk and they can feel part of the classroom. But that's also something to ask them.
Right. Okay, and kind of to wrap this up, obviously this is a podcast about happiness and trying to promote the well-being, the happiness of the people around us. So it wouldn't be right to not ask you what makes you happy.
I've been thinking about this all day. It's such a hard question.
I know.
It's your hardest question that you've asked me. Something that brings me joy is learning. And I don't mean that as like, I'm a professor and like, let's sit in a classroom and read books and learn things. It's more like, I get a lot of joy out of like learning from other people. Like in my theory class, when students help me think of the world in a different way, like that's an incredible feeling. My almost 5-year-old and my almost 3-year-olds, like when they help me see the world in a different way, that's an incredible feeling to have, and it brings me a lot of joy. Learning things from their perspectives, from students' perspectives, from other people's perspectives. I don't know if that's like happiness, if it brings me joy, it brings me pleasure, I don't know. But it's something that, those are the kinds of moments that like I carry with me and that like help me to keep moving forward.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Stiman, for coming on and answering this. I've loved having you as a teacher. I think I've made this very clear. And if anyone else is listening to this, you must take one of her classes before you graduate. But thank you. I appreciate it and appreciate you so much for coming on here.
All right. Thanks, Kelsey.